Okay, so we've come up to Prime Minister number 41. Just a quick amendment. In the last video, I said that Chamberlain was number 39. He was actually number 40. So number 41, Sir Winston Churchill. He hardly needs an introduction, but for the purpose of consistency, I am going to make this video. Um, Almost without question, Churchill is our most famous Prime Minister. There's a few others who are certainly household names, both in Britain and around the world. But I think it's fair to say that none more so than Churchill. Um, Very few other prime ministers have an adjective in the same way, Churchillian. He was one of the towering figures of the 20th century, of that there is no doubt. And not surprisingly, he's frequently cited among our top prime ministers. But I'll come to legacy in a minute. Um, for the first part of this video, I'm simply going to go through the biographical details. Then I'll speak a little bit more about the man. So I'm going to read directly from Downing Street webpage because it isn't actually too long. Churchill served twice, incidentally, from 1940 to 45 and from 1951 to 1955. He was born in 1874 at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. It's a very grand palace. And one of his ancestors was the Duke of Marlborough, who was a great general during the War of the Spanish Succession, and who was leading troops at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. Churchill always had a fascination, incidentally, with Marlborough. Winston Churchill was an inspirational statesman, writer, orator, and leader who led Britain to victory in the Second World War. He served as Conservative Prime Minister twice, before being defeated from 40 to 45, before being defeated in the 1945 general election by Clement Attlee, and from 1951 to 1955. Winston Churchill was born in, and that's what I've already mentioned, he was of rich aristocratic ancestry. Although achieving poor grades at school, his early fascination with militarism saw him join the Royal Cavalry in 1895. As a soldier and part-time journalist, Churchill travelled widely, including trips to Cuba, Afghanistan, Egypt, and South Africa. Churchill was elected as Conservative MP for Oldham in the 1900s. Today, Oldham's a very Labour seat, incidentally. Before defecting to the Liberal Party in 1904 and spending the next decade climbing the ranks of the Liberal government. He was First Lord of the Admiralty by the time of the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, which he created, and he was heavily criticised for that blunder. Gallipoli, of course, was a catastrophic campaign, very bloody battle, but a lot of soldiers also died from things like dysentery. So Churchill really got a lot of slack from that. Heavily criticised for this error, he resigned from his position and travelled to the Western Front to fight himself. The war years saw Churchill again cross the floor from the Liberals back to the Conservative Party. Incidentally, I think he'd served as Home Secretary in the Asquith administration, but I'll just double check that from the Wikipedia page. I do believe he'd served as Home Secretary. Um, nope. Maybe he was a minister in the Home Department. No, yes, Home Secretary, 1910 to 1911. He was Home Secretary at the time of the Sydney Street siege in London, which was a famous conspiracy involving, I believe, members of the Fenian Brotherhood or the predecessors of the IRA. I'll just go back to the Downing Street source. Excuse me. Um, okay. The interwar year saw Churchill again cross the floor from the Liberals back to the Conservative Party. He served as Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1924, when he controversially opted for Britain to rejoin the gold standard. Following the Tory electoral defeat in 1929, Churchill lost a seat and spent much of the next 11 years out of office, mainly writing and making speeches. Although he was alone in his firm opposition to Indian independence, his warnings against the appeasement of Nazi Germany were proven correct when the Second World War broke out in 1939. Following Neville Chamberlain's resignation in 1940, Churchill was chosen to succeed him as Prime Minister of an all-party coalition government. Some major Labour figures in that government, incidentally, were Attlee and Morrison. Churchill, who also adopted the self-created position of Minister for Defence, was active in both administrative and diplomatic functions and prosecuting the British war effort. Some of the most memorable speeches were given in this period and are credited with stimulating British morale during periods of great hardship. However, Labour leader Clement Attlee's unexpected general election victory in 1945 saw Churchill out of office and once again concentrating on public speaking. In his 1946 speech in the USA, the instinctive pro-American famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent and warned of the continued danger from a powerful Soviet Russia. By his re-election in 1951, Churchill was, in the words of Roy Jenkins, gloriously unfit for office. Aging and increasingly unwell, he often conducted business from his bedside, and while his powerful personality and oratory ability endured, the Prime Minister's leadership was less decisive than during the war. His second term was most notable for the Conservative Party's acceptance of Labour's newly created welfare state, and Churchill's effect on domestic policy was limited. His later attempts at decreasing the developing Cold War through personal diplomacy failed to produce significant results, and poor health forced him to resign in 1955, making way for his Foreign Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister Anthony Eden. Churchill died in 1965 and was honoured with a state funeral. He was 90 years old. Okay, so that's a biography. Little bit from side. Major acts: the Education Act 1944, raised the school leavers age of 14, introduction of the 11 plus. That's actually the only domestic policy I know of Churchill. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953 for his many published works. Um, so inevitably, I'm going to have to say a bit more about Churchill because he really is our most famous prime minister. Um, Inevitably, I have to have a cigar in honor of Churchill. In fact, I've got a book, Churchill Cigar. Another book, The Wicked Wits of Winston Churchill. Just like Lincoln in the United States, I believe that more books have been written about Churchill than any other prime minister. He's also featured in that book that I have about David Lloyd George, i.e., Lloyd George and Churchill, um, rivals in greatness. One more thing I'll show you before I forget. Not every prime minister gets this. This is on the 50th anniversary of his death. This was minted earlier this year, and it's a £5 coin commemorating the death of Winston Churchill 50 years ago. And there's information inside about his life and so on. £5 silver minted coin there. Not silver, but little booklet to go along with it. That cigar, of course, was his famous trademark. He also often wore that white hats. I'm not sure what his name is. Like I say, Churchill doesn't really need an introduction, but there is a few things I'd like to point out. I very much have been of the opinion, and I try to avoid leaving my personal views out of these videos, but I feel it's important to say, I very much am of the view that World War II really cemented Churchill's legacy, just as it destroyed Chamberlain's legacy. It cemented Churchill's legacy as a war leader. I firmly believe, had it not been for World War II, Churchill would be today a very controversial figure. He arguably still is in many quarters. We rightly remember him as a great war leader, and he certainly deserves all the credit he gets for that. But, well, even within the war, there was controversial incidents like the firebombing of Dresden, but people need to remember it was a total war. And I'm not going to go into very many details about that debate because I'd need to talk about that at length. Um, in his earlier political career, he'd come out with views that today would be described pretty much as far right. He described Gandhi and the Hindu nationalists as Gandhi and his gang of subversive Hindus. He tended to always have a very condescending attitude towards the colonies, and in this sense, he was very much a true blue Tory. Um, he is also on record as having said uh, talked about possibly gassing Kurdish rebels in northern Iraq, which was then a British mandate. Certainly in Ireland, he's a controversial figure. The only reason I'm saying that, by the way, is not to denigrate him, but because I do believe that with great historical figures, you do need to present a balance. And sometimes in Britain, we have a risk of martyrizing Churchill too much. Um, Churchill had many flaws. He was a great man, he was multi talented, but he had many flaws, including moral flaws. Um, and certainly he would have been opposed to, or certainly on the more conservative side of things regarding women's suffrage and so on. When he became war leader in 1940, he was 66 years old, and by the time he stepped down in 1955, I believe he was close to his 80s. 55, doing a bit of math here in my head. Yeah, I think he was about 81 when he stepped down, which makes him one of our oldest prime ministers. Not the oldest. Gladstone was 85 when he stepped down, but certainly one of the oldest. Um, he was a smoker throughout his life, fan of cigars, and apparently, according to that book, he got irritated that the Cuban CEO of that cigar company, he got annoyed by the fact the guy had his face on the cigars, and Churchill ordered that they be taken off. Um, he was an incredible wit, and he was responsible for some of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. Um, we shall fight them on land. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall never surrender. Which, if I do not for a moment believe, our empire, or a great part of it, will be overrun, then our allies across the sea will come to the rescue of the old. Okay, I know I've made a few mistakes with that speech, but if I say so myself, it's a reasonable Churchill impression. He had that sort of very gravelly voice. Churchill has very much become a personification of the British fighting spirit, and I think that's one reason he's so acknowledged also outside the United Kingdom. In 1940, we were essentially alone. We were the only great power fighting Germany alone. Um, I'm talking about outside the brave resistance movement. Um, and actually, on 9/11, Rudy Giuliani quoted Churchill. He said, when London was being bombed night after night, Londoners were being killed in the thousands. Um, they didn't give up. Well, New Yorkers are made of the same tough stuff. So Giuliani was actually quoting Churchill to resonate with the American spirit in the same way as the British spirit of the Blitz. Churchill actually was made an honorary American citizen, and he did have American blood. His mother, I believe, was American. His wife, Clementine Churchill, I don't think she was American, but Churchill was always very close to the United States. And actually, the Anglo-American relations of presidents and prime ministers forming close relations can probably date back to this time. Some other famous examples, of course, Churchill and Roosevelt. There was those famous meetings at Yalta. Potsdam was actually Atlee. Yalta, Tehran, and I believe the other one was Cairo. Or like I say in these videos, I take full responsibility for any mistakes. Um, Another thing about Churchill outside of politics, he was very accomplished in other fields. You know, a lot of politicians dabble in other endeavors. I mean, Ted Heath was a good salesman and musician, but very few not only dabble in other endeavors, but actually succeed in other endeavors. Churchill was an award-winning artist. He painted landscapes. He was an award-winning historian, and that's, I believe, how he got the Nobel Prize for Literature for his extensive historical works. One of his most famous was the History of the English-speaking Peoples. Um, and he had served as a soldier himself and a journalist during the Second World War. So he really did lead a full life. Um, he was, in terms of personality, he had quite a quick temper. He was also prone to depression, which he called his black dog. He did suffer depression for a good part of his life. He was quite a heavy drinker and smoker, which is incredible given his long life run. Um, he could be described as a tough, I guess. He was born in a palace and he was very much a blue blood. But I think also an interesting thing to note is even during the war, he wasn't universally popular. I heard in a documentary made in the 60s that after the bombing of Bristol, Churchill said, "We'll fight them. We'll keep fighting this bulldog spirit." And residents of Bristol were very annoyed by that because they said Churchill should get here himself, see if we'll keep fighting this sort of thing. So we have to remember this was total war, and there would have been times when people would have been absolutely, probably in some cases, against Churchill because in a total war, I compare it to Lincoln in some ways because both Churchill and Lincoln were war leaders. Both Churchill and Lincoln, I mean, the slight difference is because Churchill was placated by his role in the war, whereas Lincoln was deeply controversial throughout. But the comparison is in that both men had to face the pressures of war. Obviously, in Britain, it wasn't a civil war, but we did have domestic sacrifice and suffering. 69,000 British civilians died in the Blitz. So Churchill will always be cemented for his legacy in World War II. Like that article said, and I'm pleased that we're honest about this, his second term wasn't, it doesn't really stand out in the same way. And if he only served that second term, he would definitely rank among a mediocre prime minister. In fact, it's interesting to note that some academic studies have put Churchill not at the top, but second, even third from the top, which can be surprising. One study, I think, from the University of Leeds put Clement Attlee at the top of greatest prime ministers. Nevertheless, in 2002, we had a program detailing and studying who was our greatest Briton, which Britain made the greatest influence on British life. Churchill came number one. So he's very, very complex man, very great man. I've always said great figures should be scrutinized, so I I absolutely stand by some of the harsher critique of Churchill. At the same time, I think critics need to take into note his incredible wartime leadership and his incredible oratorical skill, which cannot be underestimated in terms of boosting British morale. Um, Trying to think if there's anything else I can say. His resting place is quite obscure. It's a simple slab. It's not a big grand tomb or something like that, given his fame. He got a state funeral. His coffin was brought down the River Thames in a barge. And he's one of only, I believe, four British prime ministers that have got a state funeral. The others being Viscount Palmerston, I think William Pitt the Younger, and William Gladstone. Other great prime ministers didn't get it. David Lloyd George didn't get one. Clement Attlee didn't get one. Benjamin Disraeli didn't get one. Thatcher, I think hers was a semi-state funeral. Um, so that's Winston Churchill. Um, Needless to say, he's been featured in a lot of media. He's been featured in numerous films. The Gathering Storm is a good television film. He was featured in The King's Speech, numerous films about World War II, of course. One of the good ones, it was Then There Were Giants, starring, I believe it was Bob Hoskins in the role of Churchill. And that's basically about his meetings with Stalin and Roosevelt. He's supposed to have said to Stalin, Stalin toasted the British Conservative Party and Churchill toasted the Communist Party, which is incredible. Churchill was a hardline anti-communist. Um, there isn't really much more to say because everything I've said is well. I'm trying to think of things that aren't that well known about Churchill just as a matter of interest. Um, in the film The Gathering Storm, it mentions some of his personal endeavours, like he liked Dundee cake and so on. Um, there were some family tensions during his time as Prime Minister, and some tensions with his son. His grandson, I believe, is a current Tory MP, also known as Winston Churchill. Um, that's it really. I'm not quite sure what I can add to that. If I have got any details wrong, I take full responsibility. Um, and one more thing, he served 8 years as Prime Minister. that ranks him as 12th longest serving. Sometimes we think because of his reign he was the longest serving. That's not the case. He ranks at number 12 between Asquith and Wilson. Um, and what else can I say? But I'm really trying to think of something that isn't known about him or that hasn't been covered. But there you go, Winston Churchill, almost certainly our um, best known prime minister, arguably our greatest prime minister, although I do think that's a point of debate because I think World War II very much cements that. Domestically, he didn't really achieve a great deal, or at least, like the article said, he had to really take a back step to what Labour had achieved. In 1945, when he was defeated, he was absolutely shocked. He couldn't understand the people, and it was often said the people cheered Churchill and voted for Attlee. I think what had happened in 45 was that people associated the Conservative Party with the war, and it was war fatigue basically. Labour was the opposition, and they were offering something new. Attlee was very, very respectful to Churchill in that time, and I think Churchill was slightly damaged when he made less than diplomatic remarks about Labour, despite the fact Labour had served loyally in the coalition government. So that didn't exactly do Churchill any favours. He was an incredible wit. He's supposed to have, when one woman said to him, "Mr. Churchill, you're drunk," he's supposed to have replied, "I may be drunk, madam, but in the morning I'll be sober." Um, and he's associated with many other great speeches. The Iron Curtain speech, I believe, was made in Dayton, Ohio. Not quite sure about that. One more thing, and it wasn't mentioned in the article, his second term was notable for the first British nuclear weapons tested in 1952 in the Bikini Atoll, I believe, or at least in Australian overseas territories. So the nuclear age also came into effect in Churchill's second administration. The Cold War had already begun under the Attlee administration, but it continued under Churchill. So that is Winston Churchill. Certainly, I think by today's standards, he'd never get elected because he'd be too politically incorrect. Um, and certainly, some of the things he came out with, I think the tabloids, or certainly the left-wing press, would denigrate him as a racist and a sexist. Um, so he is a controversial figure, but he let's not overlook the fact he was a great wartime leader. So that's Winston Spencer Churchill, our 41st Prime Minister.